You're not grieving a person. You haven't lost a job, ended a marriage, or received a diagnosis. Nothing has happened. And that's exactly what makes this so disorienting. What you have is a feeling that keeps arriving without an invitation. That the version of yourself you've been living inside no longer fits. Not in a dramatic way. More like a coat that used to feel like yours and now sits wrong on your shoulders. The values that organized your decisions feel borrowed. The ambitions you work toward belong somehow to someone else. The relationships that once felt natural now require a performance you're not sure you can keep giving. And instead of relief, because shouldn't growth feel like relief? What you feel is grief, a quiet, nameless grief that has no event to attach itself to, and therefore receives no validation from anyone around you. This experience doesn't have a name in most people's emotional vocabulary. It lives in the gap between "I'm fine" and something you can't quite articulate. And because it lacks a recognizable shape, it tends to get misread as ingratitude, as instability, as a phase that will pass if you push through it. Carl Jung was the only thinker to name this with the precision it deserves. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he opens with a sentence that functions less like an introduction and more like a diagnosis. My life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Not a story of achievement, not a story of accumulation. A story of something emerging from within. Slowly, often painfully, always at the cost of the form that existed before. What Jung discovered across decades of his own psychological transformation is that becoming who you actually are is not a process of addition. You do not simply grow new qualities while the old ones remain intact. The self that emerges through what he called individuation requires room. And that room only exists where something else used to be. The discomfort you're feeling isn't a malfunction. It isn't weakness or ingratitude or confusion that better therapy will resolve. It is the precise sensation of a psychological death that has no funeral, no ceremony, and no cultural script for mourning it. And the people around you, the ones who seem unsettled by your changes, who keep reaching for the version of you they recognized, are not wrong to feel the loss. They're just grieving something different than you are. What this video offers is not a way out of that discomfort. It's a way of understanding it clearly enough to stop fighting it. There is an assumption so deeply embedded in how we talk about psychological health that it almost never gets examined. That stability is good, that a coherent, consistent self is the goal, and that the person who has built a functioning identity has done something right. Jung spent his life dismantling this assumption, not because he believed in chaos, but because he understood what a functioning identity actually costs. He called it the persona. The word comes from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre. A face designed for a specific stage, a specific audience, a specific role. In Jungian psychology, the persona is not a lie exactly. It is the self you constructed in response to real demands. What your family needed you to be, what your career rewarded, what your social environment recognized and reflected back. The persona works. That's the problem. It works so well for so long that at some point it stops being a tool you pick up and becomes the face you forget you're wearing. The moment you begin to feel that your identity no longer fits is not the moment something has gone wrong. It is the moment the unconscious has grown large enough that the persona can no longer contain it. The self, Jung's term for the total personality, including everything that has never been brought into conscious life, has been expanding beneath the surface the entire time. The discomfort is not a crisis. It is pressure. The self pushing against the edges of a shape that was built for an earlier version of you. What makes this so difficult to navigate is that the ego experiences this pressure as threat rather than signal. The persona was not arbitrary. It was built for survival, for belonging, for functioning. When it begins to crack, the first instinct is to repair it, to try harder at being the person you've been, to double down on the identity that is quietly ceasing to be true. Watch for this in yourself, the moments when you perform a version of yourself you no longer feel, and then feel a specific kind of exhaustion afterward. Not physical tiredness, but the fatigue of having been unconvincing to your own interior witness. That exhaustion is diagnostic. It is the gap between persona and self, made felt. Most people interpret it as burnout or a need for rest. It is actually a need for something far more disruptive. Jung was precise about the cost of refusing this disruption. A persona held past its usefulness doesn't simply become uncomfortable. It begins to hollow out the life it was supposed to protect. The relationships built around it become performances. The ambitions attached to it feel like obligations to someone else's vision. The person inside the mask becomes increasingly invisible, even to themselves. The question is not whether this is happening to you. If you are watching this video, it probably is. The question is whether you will recognize the exhaustion for what it is, not the signal to push harder, but the signal that something beneath the surface has been waiting a long time for room to breathe. What that something is, and what it will cost you to let it through, is what the next part of this video is about. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. In the winter of 1944, Carl Jung broke his foot and suffered a heart attack. Hovering at the edge of death, he experienced a series of visions so vivid and so precise that he spent years afterward trying to find language adequate to describe them. What he recorded in memories, dreams, reflections, is one of the most psychologically honest accounts of transformation ever written. As he approached what he believed was the threshold of death, he described a sensation of having everything stripped away, the whole phantasmagoria of earthly existence, as he put it, falling from him like clothing being removed. His ambitions, his opinions, his carefully constructed sense of who he was, all of it, gone. And what remained, he wrote, was something unexpected, not emptiness, but a feeling of being entirely himself for the first time. I consisted of my own history, he wrote, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am. That passage is not a description of death. It is a description of individuation, of what happens when the accumulated layers of persona are removed and something more essential is allowed to surface. Jung nearly died to feel it. Most of us encounter a quieter version of the same process across the ordinary span of a life, whenever we are pushed, by time, by change, by inner pressure, beyond an identity we have outgrown. The grief that comes with this is real, and it deserves to be named as such. You are not being dramatic. Something is dying. The version of yourself that knew exactly who it was, that moved through the world with a certain coherence, that occupied its relationships and ambitions with a sense of fit, that version is genuinely ending. There is no ceremony for this. No one sends flowers. The people around you often cannot see what you are mourning, because from the outside, nothing has happened. Here is a practice that can make the invisible visible. Write down, without judgment, the specific things you are grieving. Not abstractions, not my old self, or who I used to be, but precise things. The certainty you had about what you wanted, the ease of a particular friendship that now requires effort, the ambition that felt like yours and now feels like a costume. Naming these things concretely does two things simultaneously. It honors the loss as real, and it begins to separate you from it enough to see it clearly. What Jung understood, and what most frameworks for psychological growth miss entirely, is that transformation is not addition. You cannot become more whole while keeping every previous layer intact. The self that is trying to emerge in you is not a new identity waiting to be installed. It is something that has always been present beneath the persona, compressed by it, waiting for the structure above it to soften enough to let it through. That softening is what the grief is. The grief is not the wound, it is the opening. The cost of this process is specific. You lose the simplicity of knowing who you are. For a period of time that cannot be predicted, you will exist between identities, no longer the person you were, not yet settled into what you are becoming. That in-between is what the next part of this video examines, because it carries its own particular difficulty. The people around you will feel the change before they understand it, and their response will add a second layer of weight to something you are already carrying alone. There is a particular loneliness that arrives when the people closest to you become uncomfortable with who you are becoming. It does not feel like conflict exactly. It feels more like a slow withdrawal of recognition, as if the face they are looking at is familiar, but the person behind it has become someone they cannot quite locate. And because they cannot name what has shifted, they reach for the explanation that costs them the least, that you have changed in a way that is wrong. This is not cruelty. It is something more structural than that. Every relationship is built around a set of implicit agreements about who each person will be. You were the reliable one, the ambitious one, the easygoing one, the one who never questioned the direction things were going. That role was not imposed on you from outside. You inhabited it, genuinely, for a time. But the people who built their understanding of the relationship around that version of you have a real investment in its continuity. When you begin to move beyond it, what they experience is not your growth. What they experience is loss. Jung observed this dynamic with characteristic precision. Individuation, he insisted, does not isolate a person from the world, but it does require a willingness to disappoint the world's expectations of who you should remain. The people who resist your transformation are often the ones who loved the persona most completely. They are grieving something real. The problem is that their grief, if you allow it to, will be used, unconsciously, without malice, as pressure to return. You will feel this pressure as guilt, the specific guilt of someone who is hurting people not by doing anything wrong, but simply by no longer being what they needed. This guilt is one of the most effective mechanisms by which transformation gets aborted. It is worth sitting with the following question, not rhetorically, but genuinely. Is the discomfort you are causing the people around you evidence that your change is harmful, or evidence that your change is real? These are not the same thing, and confusing them is costly. The practical distinction is this. Harmful change tends to produce specific damage, broken trust, abandoned responsibilities, concrete harm to people who depended on you. Authentic transformation tends to produce discomfort in people who benefited from your limitations. The friend who misses how available you used to be. The family member who preferred you when you were less certain of what you needed. The colleague who found your former self easier to predict. Their discomfort is information, but it is not instruction. What Jung's framework makes clear is that the people who will ultimately remain close to you through genuine transformation are not those who approved of every previous version. They are those capable of relating to you as you actually are, rather than as a repository for their expectations. Some relationships will not survive the crossing. This is not failure. It is the natural consequence of two people having been held together, partly by a version of you that no longer exists. The weight of this, the guilt, the withdrawal, the sense of having disappointed people who deserved better, is the second layer of the quiet pain this video is about. The first layer is the inner loss. This is the relational one. And there is a third, which may be the hardest to articulate, the silence of the process itself, the fact that it happens entirely on the inside with no external evidence to show for it, in a world that only recognizes suffering it can see. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a specific cruelty to a transformation that happens entirely on the inside. External suffering comes with a kind of social permission, a diagnosis, a loss, an event that others can point to and say, yes, that explains it. The suffering that accompanies individuation has none of this. It produces no visible wound. It generates no story that translates cleanly into the language of crisis. And because it leaves no evidence, it receives no witness, which means the person going through it is left not only to carry the weight of it, but to carry it in silence, often while suspecting that the weight itself is somehow illegitimate. Jung understood this from the inside. During the years he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, roughly 1913 to 1917, a period of profound inner turbulence following his break with Freud, he described moving through an experience that had no external form adequate to contain it. He continued seeing patients. He maintained his family life. From the outside, nothing particular was happening. From the inside, he was navigating what he would only much later be able to describe, a radical dissolution and reformation of his own psychological foundations. In memories, dreams, reflections, he wrote that his family and his profession were the anchor that kept him from being blown about entirely. Not because they resolved anything, but because they gave him a surface to return to while the deeper work continued unseen. What he identified in that period was something that applies far beyond his particular circumstances. The unconscious does not time its movements to match the external narrative of your life. It does not wait for a convenient moment, a social permission, a recognizable category of crisis. It moves when it moves. And when it does, the person experiencing it is often left trying to explain an interior earthquake using a vocabulary built entirely for surface events. This is why so many people going through genuine transformation reach for inadequate explanations. They call it burnout, because burnout is legible. They call it depression, because depression has a framework attached to it. They say they are tired, overwhelmed, going through a phase. None of these are false exactly, but they are all smaller than what is actually happening. And naming something smaller than the real thing has a cost. It orients the response in the wrong direction. You treat burnout with rest. You treat depression with medication or therapy aimed at restoring a previous equilibrium. Neither of these addresses a process whose entire point is that the previous equilibrium is no longer available. The practice that corresponds to this is simple, but requires consistency. Keep a record of the interior, not a journal of events, what happened, who said what, but a record of inner states that have no external cause you can point to. Write down what feels different today than it did 6 months ago, what no longer moves you that used to, what has begun to matter that previously seemed irrelevant. Over time, this record becomes evidence, not for anyone else, but for you. It makes the invisible process visible enough to trust. It gives the transformation a shape you can return to when the silence of it becomes disorienting. What Jung eventually came to understand about his own years of interior upheaval was that the absence of external form was not a failure of the process. It was its nature. Psychological transformation at depth does not announce itself. It does not produce the kind of suffering that others can validate, because it is not produced by the kind of events that others can see. It is produced by something growing in you that has finally become too large for the container you built for it. And that kind of pressure has no face, no name, and no clean resolution. What it has, eventually, is an emergence. And what emerges is the subject of what comes next. The question that sits at the center of this entire experience, the one that makes the grief heavier than it might otherwise be, is not, why is this happening? Most people, once they have language for what Jung described, can accept the why well enough. The question that actually frightens people is simpler and harder. If the version of myself I have been living is dissolving, what is left? It is a reasonable fear. Identity functions as orientation. It tells you what to want, who to trust, how to read a room, what kind of person you are in a crisis. When it begins to loosen, the loss is not merely emotional, it is navigational. You lose the internal compass that has been quietly organizing your decisions, and what replaces it, at least initially, is not a new compass, but a disorienting openness that can feel indistinguishable from being lost. Jung had a precise answer to this question, and it is worth sitting with carefully because it runs against the grain of almost everything contemporary culture says about self-improvement. He did not believe that what emerged through individuation was a new identity, a better, upgraded version of the self, optimized and finally correct. What he believed emerged was something older and more fundamental than any particular identity. The self, in his technical sense, the total personality that had always been present beneath the successive layers of persona, waiting not to be created, but to be uncovered. In the vision he recorded during his near-death experience of 1944, Jung described something that had stayed with him for the rest of his life. As everything was stripped away, his opinions, his ambitions, his sense of social position, what remained was not emptiness. It was a feeling of profound completeness. I consisted of my own history, he wrote, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am. I am this bundle of what has been and what has been accomplished. Nothing was added. Nothing was invented. What was left, when everything constructed had fallen away, was everything that had actually been lived. This is the deepest reframe the Jungian framework offers. You are not losing yourself. You are losing the story you told about yourself. And those are not the same thing. The experiences are still there. The relationships that shaped you, the suffering you moved through, the moments of genuine recognition, the things you built and loved and mourned. None of that dissolves. What dissolves is the particular arrangement of those things into a fixed identity, a settled answer to the question of who you are. And that arrangement, however useful it once was always partial. It always left something out. What is emerging now is a wider container, not a finished self, but a more honest one. The practice that corresponds to this moment is one of deliberate inventory, not of what you have lost, you have already been doing that, but of what has survived the dissolution. Ask yourself, with specificity, what do I still care about, underneath the ambitions I have outgrown? What relationships feel real rather than performed? What pulls my attention when I am not managing an image? The answers will not arrive as a new identity fully formed. They will arrive as fragments, partial recognitions, quiet insistences. Pay attention to them. They are not random. They are the outline of what the self has been trying to show you the entire time. What Jung's life demonstrated, not as theory but as lived example, is that the person who comes through genuine individuation is not unrecognizable. They are, in a specific sense, more recognizable to themselves and eventually to the people capable of knowing them as they actually are. The crossing costs the form. What it returns is something that no particular form was ever large enough to contain. That is not consolation. It is simply what the process is for. And understanding it changes what the final step requires of you. There is a temptation, once you understand what individuation actually is, to treat that understanding as a rival, to feel the grief name itself, to recognize the pressure of the self against the persona, to see the relational costs clearly, and to mistake the clarity for completion. It is not. Understanding the map is not the same as crossing the terrain, and the terrain, as Jung was careful to insist, does not become easier simply because you can now describe it accurately. What changes when you understand it is your relationship to the discomfort, not the discomfort itself. That remains. The grief is still grief. The loneliness of the process is still loneliness. The guilt of disappointing people who preferred the previous version of you does not dissolve because you have a framework for why it is happening. What changes is whether you move through it consciously or whether you spend your energy trying to make it stop. This distinction is everything. The person who suppresses transformation does not escape the pressure. They redirect it. It surfaces as a vague and persistent dissatisfaction with a life that looks correct from the outside, as a recurring sense that something essential is missing, without being able to name what, as the particular exhaustion of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for so long that they can no longer locate where the performance ends. Jung was unambiguous about the cost of this. Anyone who takes the shore road, he wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, is as good as dead. Then nothing happens any longer. At any rate, not the right things. The shore road is the road back to the persona, the road back to the identity that worked, that was recognized, that caused less disruption in the systems around you. It is available. You can take it. Many people do, and they live functional, organized, and quietly diminished lives inside it. This is not a judgment. It is a description of what the choice costs over time. The alternative is not heroic, and it is not linear. Crossing consciously means, in practice, three things. First, allowing the grief to be grief, without immediately converting it into a problem to be solved. The loss of a former self is a real loss. It deserves to be mourned, not managed. Second, maintaining the distinction between the discomfort of transformation and evidence that the transformation is wrong. These feel identical from the inside. They are not. One is the sensation of growth under pressure. The other is a genuine signal that a particular direction needs to be reconsidered. You learn to tell them apart, not through analysis, but through sustained, honest attention to what the interior is actually saying beneath the noise of guilt and fear. Third, trusting that the incompleteness of the in-between is not a failure of the process. The period between identities, no longer who you were, not yet settled into what you are becoming, is not a malfunction. It is the process itself, in its most essential form. Jung did not emerge from his own years of interior upheaval with a finished self. He emerged with a deeper relationship to the unfinished nature of psychological life, with what he described as an unconditional yes to things as they are, including the permanent uncertainty of who one is still becoming. That yes is not passive acceptance. It is an active, deliberate decision to remain present to a process that offers no guarantees and no clean destination. What this video has tried to give you is not comfort. It is precision. The quiet pain of becoming someone new is not a sign that something has gone wrong inside you. It is the specific texture of a life in genuine motion, of a self that has outgrown its container and is pressing, as it always does, towards something more honest and more whole. The question is not whether you will feel that pressure. You already do. The question is what you choose to do with it. If what you heard today has been sitting with you in a way that feels unfinished, the way real things do, the video appearing on your screen right now will take it further. Click to keep watching.